The gunshot echoed through the narrow valley, and Katherine Lawrence didn't flinch, didn't scream, didn't even look up from the empty grave she'd been staring at for the past hour. The sound was distant enough not to matter, close enough to remind her that Concordia, Kansas wasn't the peaceful farming town it pretended to be in the daylight. She stood alone in the cemetery on the edge of town, her black dress covered in dust from the trail, her eyes dry because she'd learned 3 years ago that tears didn't bring anyone back. "Madam, you shouldn't be out here alone after dark." The voice came from behind her, deep and careful, the kind of voice that knew how to gentle a spooked horse. Katherine turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. The man sat atop a bay gelding, his silhouette backlit by the dying sun. She could make out a worn hat, broad shoulders, and the easy posture of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than out of it. "I'm fine where I am," she said, her voice flat and uninviting. The rider dismounted with practiced grace, keeping his hands visible. As he stepped closer, she could see his face more clearly in the fading light. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with a square jaw darkened by a few days of stubble and eyes that held something she couldn't quite name. Concern, maybe, or pity, which she wanted even less. "Name's Thomas Dalton," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I work the spread just north of here. Saw you standing out here when I rode past earlier and you're still here. Gets dangerous after sundown." "Everything's dangerous, Mr. Dalton. Standing in a cemetery isn't any more so than sleeping in a bed or walking down a street or loving someone." The last words came out bitter, and she saw him absorb them like a blow. "Can't argue with that, I suppose," Thomas said quietly. He glanced at the grave marker in front of her, fresh enough that the wood hadn't weathered yet. "Lost someone recently?" Katherine looked back at the grave, her jaw tight. "My sister, Sarah. She was 19. She didn't elaborate, didn't explain how Sarah had trusted the wrong man, how that man had left her ruined and shamed, how Sarah had walked into the river one cold March morning and never walked out. The details were Katherine's to carry, heavy as stones. Thomas removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "I'm sorry for your loss. Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything." Katherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the evening had become. It was late April in 1876, and Kansas spring nights still carried winter's teeth. "No, madam, it doesn't," Thomas agreed, "but it's all most folks have to offer." He stood there for a moment longer, then started to turn back toward his horse. "I'll wait by the road until you're ready to head back to town, just to make sure you get there safe. I don't need a guardian. Didn't say you did, but I'd sleep better knowing you made it home without trouble." Katherine wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to leave her alone, but the truth was that the walk back to town in full darkness didn't appeal to her either. "Suit yourself," she said instead. She stayed at the grave for another 10 minutes, not praying because she'd stopped believing in a God that would let someone as good as Sarah suffer, just standing in the silence and remembering. When she finally turned to leave, Thomas was waiting by the cemetery gate, his horse's reins in hand. They walked in silence for most of the mile back to Concordia, Thomas leading his horse and maintaining a polite distance. The town came into view, its scattered lights warm against the darkening prairie. Concordia sat along the Republican River, established less than 20 years prior, a growing town that served the farmers and ranchers spreading across north-central Kansas. "Where can I see you home to?" Thomas asked as they reached the first buildings. "The boarding house on 2nd Street. Mrs. Fletcher's place." Thomas nodded and adjusted his path accordingly. The boarding house was a 2-story structure near the center of town, respectable and clean. When they reached the front steps, Katherine turned to face him properly for the first time. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Dalton, though I maintain it was unnecessary." "Probably was," he agreed with a slight smile, "but my mother raised me to err on the side of caution when it comes to a lady's safety." Katherine studied him in the light spilling from the boarding-house windows. He had kind eyes, she realized, the color of aged whiskey, and hands that looked strong but not cruel. Everything about him seemed solid and genuine, which only made her more wary. "Your mother raised you well, then. Good evening." She started up the steps. "Miss Lawrence." She paused, looking back. "I hope you'll find some peace," Thomas said. "Grief's a heavy burden to carry alone." "I'm used to heavy burdens, Mr. Dalton, and I prefer carrying them alone." She went inside without waiting for his response, closing the door firmly behind her. Katherine climbed the stairs to her small room, lit the lamp on her bedside table, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Fletcher moving around downstairs, the murmur of other boarders settling in for the night. She'd been living here for 2 weeks, ever since she'd come back to Concordia to settle Sarah's affairs and bury her properly. Before that, she'd been working as a seamstress in Abilene, trying to build a life away from the memories that haunted every corner of their childhood home. Their parents had died when Katherine was 18 and Sarah 15, victims of the cholera that had swept through Kansas in 1867. Katherine had kept them together, working any job she could find, protecting Sarah, planning for their future. And Sarah had still ended up in a grave at 19, destroyed by a smooth-talking gambler who'd promised her the world and left her with nothing but shame and a pregnancy that ended the same night. Sarah walked into the river. Katherine undressed mechanically, pulled on her nightgown, and slid between the rough sheets. She didn't expect to sleep well. She rarely did anymore, but she dreamed of kind eyes the color of whiskey and a voice that knew how to gentle spooked horses, and woke feeling more unsettled than rested. The next morning, Katherine walked to the small dress shop where she'd found temporary work. Mrs. Morrison, the owner, was a widow in her 50s who'd welcomed Katherine's skilled fingers and didn't ask too many questions about her past. "You look tired, dear, Mrs. Morrison observed as Katherine settled at her sewing station near the window. "I'm fine," Katherine replied, threading her needle with practiced efficiency. "You're always fine," Mrs. Morrison said gently, "but fine isn't the same as well." Katherine focused on the dress in front of her, a blue calico that needed the hem adjusted. "I'm well enough to work, which is what matters." Mrs. Morrison sighed but didn't push further. They worked in comfortable silence for the next hour, the only sounds the whisper of thread through fabric and the occasional customer entering the shop. Katherine was pinning a difficult seam when the bell over the door chimed. She glanced up and felt her stomach tighten. Thomas Dalton stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand, looking decidedly out of place among the bolts of fabric and half-finished dresses. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Morrison asked, moving toward him with a welcoming smile. "Yes, madam. I'm looking for Miss Lawrence, if she's available." Mrs. Morrison's eyebrows rose with interest, and she glanced back at Katherine with barely concealed curiosity. "She is indeed." "Katherine." Katherine set down her work carefully and approached the counter, keeping it between herself and Thomas. "Mr. Dalton, I didn't expect to see you again." "I know this is forward, and you can say no without any hard feelings," Thomas began, turning his hat in his hands. "But I was wondering if you'd join me for supper this evening. There's a decent restaurant just opened up on 3rd Street. The food's good, and the conversation wouldn't have to be about anything heavy." Katherine stared at him, momentarily speechless. Behind her, she could practically feel Mrs. Morrison's delighted interest. "Why?" The word came out sharper than she intended. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Because I'd like to get to know you better. Because you seemed like you could use a friend. Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since last night. You don't know anything about me. That's generally why people have conversations over supper, he said with a gentle smile. To get to know each other. I'm not interested in courtship, Mr. Dalton, or friendship, or whatever it is you're offering. Then just interested in a meal, he suggested. Everyone's got to eat. Might as well have some company while doing it. Katherine wanted to refuse. Every instinct told her to send him away, to maintain the walls she'd built so carefully around her heart. But there was something about his earnestness, the way he stood there accepting her hostility without flinching, that made her pause. One meal, she heard herself say. And if I find the conversation disagreeable, you'll accept that and not ask again. Deal, Thomas said, his face brightening. I'll come by Mrs. Fletcher's at 6 if that suits you. 6 is acceptable. He nodded, replaced his hat, and tipped it politely to both women. Mrs. Morrison. Miss Lawrence, I'll see you this evening. After he left, Katherine returned to her sewing station, acutely aware of Mrs. Morrison watching her with barely contained excitement. Don't, Katherine said before the older woman could speak. I didn't say anything. You were thinking it loudly enough. Mrs. Morrison laughed. He's a good man, that Thomas Dalton. Works hard, treats people fairly. His family's ranch is one of the most successful in the county, and he's easy on the eyes, which doesn't hurt. It's just supper, Mrs. Morrison, nothing more. If you say so, dear. But the knowing smile on Mrs. Morrison's face suggested she believed otherwise. Katherine tried to focus on her work for the rest of the day, but her thoughts kept drifting. She didn't want this. Didn't want the complication of someone showing interest in her. Didn't want to feel the flutter of nervousness in her stomach when she thought about sitting across from Thomas Dalton at supper. She'd loved once, or thought she had. Back when she was 20, there'd been a young farmer named Daniel who'd courted her properly, who talked about marriage and building a life together. But when their parents died and Katherine suddenly had a younger sister to raise, Daniel had disappeared faster than morning dew. He'd wanted a wife, not a ready-made family and the burden of someone else's grief. That had taught Katherine that love was conditional, that people left when things got hard, that trusting someone with your heart was the fastest way to get it broken. And then Sarah, who'd been so beautiful and hopeful, had trusted the wrong man and paid with her life. If Sarah, who'd believed in love with her whole heart, could be destroyed by it, what chance did Katherine have? But when 6 o'clock came and she heard the knock on the boarding house door, Katherine found herself checking her reflection one last time, smoothing her second-best dress and tucking a stray curl back into place. Thomas stood on the front porch, cleaned up from the dust of the ranch, wearing a pressed shirt and a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see her. You look lovely, he said. It's the same dress I wore yesterday. And you looked lovely yesterday, too. He offered his arm. Shall we? The restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread filling the air. Thomas held Katherine's chair for her before taking his own seat, and when the server came by, he asked Katherine what she'd like before ordering for both of them. So, Thomas said once they were alone again, tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with grief or loss, something that's just Katherine. Katherine folded her hands in her lap, considering. I like sewing, not just the practical aspects of it, but the creativity. Taking fabric and thread and making something beautiful. That's why you work at the dress shop. I worked as a seamstress in Abilene before coming back here. Mrs. Morrison was kind enough to give me work while I settle Sarah's affairs. You planning to stay in Concordia or head back to Abilene? Katherine hadn't actually decided yet. I don't know. Sarah's buried here, but there's not much else keeping me. The food arrived, simple but well prepared, and they ate in silence for a few minutes. Katherine found herself relaxing slightly despite her best intentions. "What about you?" she asked. "How does a rancher end up escorting strange women home from cemeteries?" Thomas smiled. "My father started the ranch about 15 years ago, brought the family out from Missouri. I was just a boy then. We built it up together, him and my mother and me and my younger brother. Lost my father 5 years back to a riding accident. My mother remarried a couple years later, moved to Denver with her new husband. My brother headed to California to try his luck in business. So now it's just me running the place. That must be lonely." "Sometimes," Thomas admitted, "but the work keeps me busy. We run cattle, some horses. Got about a dozen hands working for me, good men mostly. It's a decent life, but a solitary one, which is why I asked you to supper." His eyes held hers. "I'm not looking for just anyone, Katherine. But when I saw you in that cemetery, standing there so strong even though I could see how much you were hurting, I thought maybe you understood what it's like to carry on when everything feels broken." Katherine set down her fork carefully. "I'm not strong, Mr. Dalton. I'm just still breathing because stopping isn't an option. That's the definition of strength, seems to me. Then you have a generous definition." She took a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. "I appreciate your kindness." "I do. But I need you to understand something. I don't have anything to offer anyone. The parts of me that knew how to care about someone, how to trust, how to hope for a future, they're gone. Sarah's death wasn't the beginning of that, it was just the final confirmation." "Confirmation of what?" "That love doesn't protect you. That caring about people just gives the world more ways to hurt you. That the smart thing to do is keep yourself locked away where nothing can reach you." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her. "That's not living, Katherine. That's just existing." "Existing is safer. Safer isn't always better," says someone who hasn't been hurt enough yet. "I watched my father die," Thomas said quietly. "Thrown from a horse he'd ridden 1,000 times, broke his neck, gone before we could even get him back to the house. I held my mother while she cried herself sick for months. I had to become a man overnight, take over the ranch, make decisions I wasn't ready for. I know about hurt, Katherine. I know about loss. Then why are you here? Why risk more of it?" "Because the alternative is dying inside while your body keeps walking around. Because my father taught me that life is meant to be lived fully, even knowing it ends. Because I'd rather feel everything, the good and the bad, than feel nothing at all." Katherine looked away, fighting the burning in her chest. "I can't be what you want. I'm not asking you to be anything except honest. Have supper with me again. Let me get to know you. No expectations, no promises. Just two people sharing a meal and some conversation. Why waste your time?" "It's my time to waste." Thomas reached across the table, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand. "One more supper. If you still want me to leave you alone after that, I will." Katherine knew she should refuse, should end this now before it went any further. But something in her, some small part that wasn't quite dead yet, whispered yes. "One more," she agreed. "But I mean it, Mr. Dalton. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be what people expect." "Then don't be what people expect. Just be yourself." They finished their meal with easier conversation, and Thomas walked her back to the boarding house as the spring evening settled into night. At the door, he tipped his hat to her. "Same time next week?" he asked, "I suppose." "Try to contain your enthusiasm," he said with a smile that made her lips twitch despite herself. "Good night, Mr. Dalton. Thomas, if we're going to be having regular suppers, you might as well use my given name." "Good night, Thomas." "Good night, Katherine." She went inside feeling unsettled and confused. Emotions she'd worked hard to bury rising to the surface like spring flowers pushing through hard ground. The next week passed slowly. Katherine worked at the dress shop, walked to Sarah's grave 3 times, and tried not to think about the supper appointment she'd agreed to. Mrs. Morrison noticed her distraction, but was kind enough not to comment on it directly, though her knowing looks said plenty. On Thursday, a commotion outside the shop drew both women to the window. A group of riders had come into town, rough-looking men with hard eyes and guns worn low on their hips. Katherine recognized the type from her years in Abilene. Trouble, looking for a place to happen. Drifters, Mrs. Morrison said with a frown. We get them sometimes, passing through on their way to somewhere else. Best to stay inside and out of their way. But the men didn't pass through. They settled into the saloon, and by evening the sounds of drinking and gambling carried through the street. Katherine heard it from her room at the boarding house, the wild laughter and occasional shouts that spoke of men with too much liquor and not enough sense. She was preparing for bed when gunshots rang out, close enough to make her jump. More shouts followed, and the thunder of horses riding hard through town. Katherine moved to her window, peering out through the curtains. Below, she could see people emerging cautiously from buildings, looking toward the saloon. Someone ran past, calling for the sheriff. And in the street, lying motionless in the dust, was a figure in dark clothes. Katherine's heart seized. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and ran downstairs, ignoring Mrs. Fletcher's calls to stay inside. She pushed through the gathering crowd, and her breath caught when she saw Thomas kneeling beside the fallen man, pressing a bandana against a wound on the stranger's shoulder. "What happened?" she demanded, dropping to her knees beside him. Thomas looked up, surprised to see her. "Those drifters started a fight. This fellow tried to break it up, took a bullet for his trouble. Bastards rode off before anyone could stop them." The wounded man groaned, and Katherine got her first good look at his face. He was young, maybe 22 or 23, with fair hair and features that would have been handsome without the pain twisting them. "Someone get the doctor," Thomas shouted over his shoulder. To Katherine, he said, "Keep pressure on this while I check for other injuries." She pressed her hands over the bandana, feeling warm blood seep between her fingers. The wounded man's eyes flickered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. "You're going to be all right," Katherine heard herself say, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "The doctor's coming." "Hurts," the man managed. "I know. Stay still." The doctor arrived, a gray-haired man with efficient hands and a calm demeanor. He examined the wound quickly, then directed several men to carry the patient to his office down the street. As they lifted him, the wounded man cried out, and Katherine felt the sound cut through her. "Go with them," Thomas said quietly. "He's going to need someone when he comes around properly. Dr. Harris is good with wounds, but not so much with frightened patients. I don't even know him." "Does that matter?" Katherine looked at Thomas, at the blood on his hands and the concern in his eyes, and realized it didn't. She followed the men to the doctor's office. The next hours passed in a blur of boiling water, torn bandages, and the wounded man's occasional cries as Dr. Harris extracted the bullet and stitched the wound closed. Katherine stayed, doing what she was told, offering water and quiet reassurances when the young man surfaced from his pain-induced haze. It was nearly midnight when Dr. Harris finally stepped back, wiping his hands on a towel. "He'll live, barring infection. Lost some blood, but the bullet didn't hit anything vital. Lucky. Or unlucky to get shot in the first place," Katherine observed. The doctor smiled tiredly. "True enough. Someone should stay with him tonight, make sure the fever doesn't spike. I can do it, but I've got Mrs. Henderson about to deliver her baby any time, and I should be available for that." "I'll stay," Katherine said before she could think better of it. "You sure? It's not proper. A young, unmarried woman staying alone with a strange man. Propriety seems less important than keeping him alive. Dr. Harris nodded approvingly. There's blankets in the cupboard. Wake me if his fever gets worse or the bleeding starts up again. I'm just next door. After he left, Katherine settled into a chair beside the narrow bed where the wounded man lay sleeping. Someone had identified him as William Carter, a ranch hand from one of the spreads east of town, in Concordia to collect his pay and apparently in the wrong place at the wrong time. She dozed intermittently, waking periodically to check his breathing and temperature. Around 3 in the morning, his eyes opened and focused on her with more clarity. "You're the lady from the street," he said, his voice rough but stronger than before. "Katherine Lawrence. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been shot." He tried to smile, winced instead. "Thank you for staying. The doctor needed someone to watch you. Still, you didn't have to." He shifted slightly, sucking in a breath at the pain. "Those men, the ones fighting, they were going to hurt a girl, just a saloon girl, but she didn't deserve what they were planning. I had to try to stop them." "Very noble." "Nearly got you killed. Some things are worth the risk." His eyes drifted closed again. "Even if it hurts." Katherine thought about that as she sat in the quiet office, listening to William's breathing even out. Worth the risk. Thomas had said something similar, about choosing to feel everything rather than nothing at all. Maybe they were both fools. Or maybe she was the fool for choosing numbness over life. Morning light was creeping through the windows when Thomas appeared in the doorway, looking tired but carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and coffee. "Thought you might need breakfast," he said quietly, setting the basket on the doctor's desk. "How's he doing?" "Better. The fever's stayed low. Dr. Harris thinks he'll recover fully." Thomas poured coffee from a thermos into 2 tin cups, handing one to Katherine. She accepted it gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the warm metal. "You stayed all night," Thomas observed. "Someone needed to." "You've got a kind heart, Katherine Lawrence, no matter how hard you try to pretend otherwise." Katherine sipped her coffee, too tired to argue. Thomas pulled up another chair and sat beside her, and they waited together in comfortable silence for the doctor to return. When William woke again, more alert this time, Thomas helped him drink some water and eat a little of the bread. The young man was grateful and embarrassed in equal measure. "I'll pay for the doctor's services as soon as I can get to my wages," William promised. "Already taken care of," Thomas said. "You did a brave thing standing up for someone who needed help. That deserves to be honored, not punished with debt." Katherine looked at Thomas with new eyes. He'd paid a stranger's medical bills without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. The gesture spoke of a generosity that seemed at odds with her understanding of how the world worked. But maybe her understanding was incomplete. Maybe pain and loss had taught her lessons that weren't entirely true. Dr. Harris returned, checked his patient, and pronounced him out of danger. "He'll need to rest here for a few days, but barring complications, he should be back to work within a month." Thomas offered to arrange for William's employer to be notified, and Katherine finally allowed herself to be escorted back to the boarding house. She was exhausted, her dress stained with blood, her mind foggy with fatigue. "Thank you," she said to Thomas at the door, "for breakfast and for helping." "That's what neighbors do," Thomas replied. "Get some rest. I'll see you Saturday for supper if you're still willing." "I'm still willing," she found herself saying. His smile was like sunrise, warm and full of promise. "Good. Sleep well, Katherine." She climbed to her room, collapsed onto her bed, and slept dreamlessly until late afternoon. The following days settled into a new rhythm. Katherine worked at the dress shop, visited Sarah's grave less frequently, and found herself looking forward to Saturday with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety she couldn't quite name. When the evening came, Thomas arrived promptly at 6 with a spring wagon instead of his horse. "Thought we might have supper somewhere different tonight if you're amenable," he said. "There's a spot about a mile out of town, up on a hill overlooking the river, beautiful at sunset, and I packed us a meal." Katherine hesitated. Being alone with him outside of town felt dangerous, a step beyond the careful distance she'd been maintaining. "I promise to be a perfect gentleman," Thomas added, reading her uncertainty. "And if you're uncomfortable at any point, I'll bring you straight back." "All right," Katherine agreed, letting him help her up onto the wagon seat. They drove through town and out onto the prairie, following a track that wound through the tall grass. The evening was perfect, warm without being hot, the sky clear and endless overhead. Thomas pointed out landmarks as they went, talking easily about the land and the seasons, the challenges of ranching and the satisfaction of working with animals. The spot he'd chosen was everything he'd promised. The hill rose gently above the Republican River, offering a view of the water winding through the valley and the town nestled along its banks. Thomas spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree and unpacked their supper: fried chicken, biscuits, cheese, and apple pie that he admitted his cook had made. "You have a cook?" Katherine asked, amused despite herself. "Old Pete's been with the ranch since my father's time. He's better with cattle than cuisine, but his pie's decent." Thomas settled on the blanket, leaving plenty of room for Katherine. She sat carefully, arranging her skirts, and accepted the plate he offered. They ate watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, the beauty so profound it made Katherine's chest ache. "This is where I come when I need to think," Thomas said after a while. "Or when I need to remember why I'm doing what I'm doing. Something about seeing the land like this, all spread out peaceful and beautiful, it reminds me that there's good in the world. Or it reminds you how small we are, how little any of it matters. Does it have to be one or the other? Can it be both?" Thomas turned to look at her, his expression serious. "We're small, yes, and someday we'll be gone and the river will keep flowing and the grass will keep growing. But while we're here, what we do matters. How we treat people matters. Love matters." "Love breaks you," Katherine said, her voice tight. "It makes you vulnerable and then it destroys you when it's taken away." "Sometimes. But isn't the having of it worth the losing? How can you say that? You lost your father. Doesn't it hurt every single day?" "Yes," Thomas said simply. "Every single day. But I had 20 years with him. 20 years of learning from him, laughing with him, being loved by him. If I could go back and choose never to have known him to avoid the pain of losing him, I wouldn't. Not for anything in the world." Katherine felt tears burning behind her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since Sarah's death. "I don't have your strength. You have more than you think." Thomas shifted slightly closer, not touching but present. "Katherine, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you to promise me anything. I'm just asking you to let me spend time with you, to let me show you that not everyone leaves, that not everything ends in pain. What if I can't? What if I'm too broken? Then we'll be broken together." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Nobody gets through life without cracks, Katherine. The question is whether we let those cracks destroy us or whether we fill them with gold and become something new. She wanted to believe him. Wanted it with a ferocity that terrified her. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to let someone in. I don't know how to love." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused from work, his fingers gentle as they curled around hers. "Then let me teach you," he said. "No rushing, no expectations. Just one day at a time, one moment at a time. Let me show you what it looks like when someone stays." Katherine looked down at their joined hands, feeling the connection like a shock through her system. Part of her wanted to pull away, to run back to the safety of her emotional walls. But another part, the part that had stayed up all night with a wounded stranger, the part that had agreed to this supper in the first place, wanted desperately to try. "I might hurt you," she said. "I might push you away or say cruel things or be unable to give you what you need. I'll take that risk. Why me? There must be dozens of women in Kansas who would welcome your attention, women who aren't damaged and difficult and full of grief." Thomas smiled, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Because when I saw you standing in that cemetery, strong and broken and still breathing, I recognized something. A kindred spirit, maybe. Someone who understands that life is hard but shows up anyway. I don't want easy, Katherine. I want real. Real is messy. I run a cattle ranch. I'm familiar with messy." A laugh broke from her, unexpected and slightly watery. "That's not romantic." "I'll work on my poetry," Thomas promised. He squeezed her hand gently. "Stay with me here a while longer. Watch the stars come out." Katherine nodded, not trusting her voice. They sat together as the sun slipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, diamond bright against the deepening blue. Thomas didn't press her to talk, didn't demand anything, just sat holding her hand like it was something precious. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, Katherine felt something inside her begin to thaw. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Thomas came to town twice a week, always on Tuesday and Saturday evenings. Sometimes they had supper at the restaurant. Sometimes they drove out to his hill overlooking the river. Once he brought her to the ranch, showing her the operation with obvious pride. The Dalton spread was impressive. Several hundred acres of grassland with a sturdy ranch house, a large barn and various outbuildings. The cattle grazed in distant pastures, watched over by ranch hands who tipped their hats respectfully when introduced to Katherine. Old Pete, the cook Thomas had mentioned, turned out to be a leathery man of indeterminate age with sharp eyes and a protective attitude toward Thomas. "About time he found himself a lady," Pete said to Katherine while Thomas was showing her the horses. "Boy works too hard, spends too much time alone, needs someone to remind him there's more to life than cattle and fences." "I'm not sure I'm that person," Katherine admitted. Pete studied her with an assessing gaze. "You're here, aren't you? That's a start." The horses were beautiful, well cared for animals with sleek coats and intelligent eyes. Thomas introduced each one by name, clearly fond of them all. But when they reached the last stall, his expression shifted to something softer. "This is Dancer," he said, gesturing to a dappled gray mare with a white blaze. "She was my mother's horse, gentle as they come, perfect for someone learning to ride." Katherine looked at him sharply. "I never said I wanted to learn to ride. You didn't have to. I see how you look at them. There's interest there, even if you're trying to hide it." Thomas opened the stall door and led Dancer out into the aisle. "What do you say? Just a short ride around the paddock?" "I'll lead her and you can get a feel for it." Every instinct told Katherine to refuse. Horse riding meant vulnerability, meant trusting the animal and trusting Thomas to keep her safe. It meant admitting she wanted something beyond mere survival, but she'd been trying, these past weeks. Trying to open up, trying to believe that maybe Thomas was right about life being worth the risk. "Just around the paddock," she said. Thomas's face lit up like she'd given him a gift. He saddled Dancer with efficient movements, then helped Katherine mount, his hand steady on her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. The height was dizzying at first, the feeling of the horse moving beneath her strange and unsettling. "I've got you," Thomas said, one hand on the bridle, the other resting reassuringly on Katherine's knee. "Just relax and move with her. Dancer's done this 1,000 times." They walked slowly around the paddock, Thomas keeping up a steady stream of encouragement and instruction. Katherine gripped the saddle horn tight at first, every muscle tense. But gradually, as Dancer plodded along calmly and Thomas remained steady beside her, she began to relax. By the third circuit of the paddock, she was actually enjoying herself. The rhythm of the horse's gait, the warm spring air, the feeling of doing something new and slightly daring, it all combined to create a moment of pure presence. No past, no grief, just this. "You're a natural," Thomas said, grinning up at her. "Another few lessons and you'll be ready for a real ride. Don't get ahead of yourself, Cowboy." "Yes, madam." But his eyes danced with pleasure. They finished the circuit, and Thomas helped her down, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary on her waist. Katherine looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how easy it would be to lean in just a little and discover what his lips tasted like. The thought shocked her. She'd been so focused on just allowing his friendship that she hadn't considered the possibility of wanting more. "Thank you," she said, stepping back slightly. "That was actually enjoyable. We'll do it again soon," Thomas promised. On the ride back to town, Katherine was quiet, processing the confusion of feelings swirling inside her. She was starting to care about Thomas, she realized. Starting to look forward to their time together. To notice details like the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and how his laugh sounded different when it was genuinely amused versus merely polite. It terrified her. That night, lying in her bed at the boarding house, Katherine acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling for Thomas Dalton, despite her best efforts not to. Despite her certainty that she was too broken for love, that opening her heart would only lead to more pain. The realization kept her awake until dawn, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The next morning at the dress shop, Mrs. Morrison took one look at Katherine's face and sat her down with a cup of tea. "All right, dear. What's troubling you?" Katherine wrapped her hands around the cup, staring into the amber liquid. "How do you know when you're ready to love again?" After loss, Mrs. Morrison's expression softened with understanding. She'd lost her own husband to a heart attack 7 years prior, Katherine knew. "You don't really," the older woman said. "There's no magic moment when you wake up healed and whole. You just decide that the risk of loving again is less frightening than the certainty of being alone. But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail at it?" "Love isn't a test you pass or fail, Katherine. It's a choice you make every day. Some days that choice is easy, some days it's hard as climbing a mountain. But the choosing itself is what matters. Thomas wants me to trust him, to believe he won't leave. And do you believe it?" Katherine considered. "I think I want to." "Then start there." Mrs. Morrison patted her hand. "That young man's been coming around regular for weeks now, patient as a saint. He's not going anywhere unless you drive him away. The question is whether you're brave enough to let him stay." That evening, Katherine walked to Sarah's grave alone. She stood looking at the marker, thinking about her sister's belief in love and how badly it had ended. "I don't know if you can hear me," Katherine said quietly, "but I need to talk to you. There's a man, Thomas. He's good and kind and he wants me to let him close. And I'm scared, Sarah. I'm so scared of ending up like you, destroyed by trusting the wrong person." The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of prairie flowers. "But I'm also scared of spending the rest of my life locked away from everything. Thomas says love is worth the risk. I want to believe him. I think maybe I do believe him, at least about himself. He's not like that gambler who hurt you. He's steady and real." Katherine knelt beside the grave, placing her palm flat on the earth. "I'm going to try, Sarah. I'm going to try to love him, even though I don't really know how anymore, even though it terrifies me. I think you'd want that for me. I think you'd tell me to be brave." The tears came then, finally, the grief she'd been holding back since the funeral. She cried for Sarah, for their parents, for the girl she'd been before loss had hardened her. She cried until she was empty, until the sun had set and the stars were appearing overhead. When she finally stood to leave, she felt lighter. Not healed, maybe never fully healed, but less burdened. Ready, perhaps, to try. Thomas came by on Tuesday as usual, but instead of going to the restaurant, Katherine asked if they could walk instead. They strolled through town and out onto the prairie, following the river as it curved through the valley. "I've been thinking about what you said," Katherine began, "about teaching me how to love, about taking things one day at a time." Thomas glanced at her, his expression carefully neutral. And I want to try, really try, not just go through the motions." She stopped walking, turning to face him. "But I need you to understand what you're signing up for. I'm going to be difficult sometimes. I'm going to pull away when I get scared. I'm going to test whether you really mean it when you say you'll stay. I know. And you still want this." Thomas reached out, cupping her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Katherine, I've wanted this since the moment I saw you. Every version of you, the strong parts and the broken parts and everything in between. I'm not looking for easy, I'm looking for you." "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Neither do I, really. I've never felt this way about anyone before." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "But I know I want to try. I know that every moment I spend with you feels more real than anything else in my life. I know that when I imagine my future, you're in it. That's terrifying." "Absolutely terrifying," he agreed with a slight smile. "But also kind of wonderful, don't you think?" Katherine let herself lean into his touch, let herself feel the warmth of his hands and the steadiness of his gaze. "I think I might be falling in love with you," she admitted, "and it scares me more than anything I've ever felt." "I know I'm falling in love with you," Thomas said. "Have been since that first night in the cemetery. And yes, it's scary, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Katherine's heart hammered against her ribs, her hands trembling as she gripped his forearms. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to protect herself, to retreat behind her walls. But she stayed. When Thomas's lips met hers, soft and questioning, Katherine felt something shift inside her. A wall crumbling, a door opening, a part of herself she'd locked away stirring back to life. She kissed him back tentatively, then with growing confidence as he pulled her closer. It wasn't like anything she'd experienced before. Not the fumbling kisses of her youth, not the restrained affection of her brief courtship with Daniel. This was deeper, more profound, a connection that felt like recognition and promise wrapped together. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "That," he said, "was worth every risk." Katherine laughed, the sound shaky but genuine. "Don't get cocky, Cowboy. That was just one kiss. Then I guess I'll have to work on earning more." They walked back to town hand in hand, and Katherine felt lighter than she had in years. It wasn't that her grief had disappeared or that her fears had vanished. But for the first time, she believed that maybe joy could exist alongside the sorrow, that maybe she could build a future without betraying her past. The next weeks passed in a blur of growing closeness. Thomas continued his regular visits, but now they included stolen kisses and held hands, longer conversations and deeper revelations. Katherine told him about her childhood, about her parents' deaths and the struggle to keep Sarah safe. Thomas shared his own stories, the good and the bad, the triumphs and failures that had shaped him. They rode together, Katherine growing more confident on Dancer with each lesson. They picnicked by the river and walked through town and spent long evenings on the porch of the boarding house, talking until Mrs. Fletcher had to remind them of propriety and the late hour. Katherine still had hard days, moments when the grief rose up and threatened to drown her, when fear whispered that this couldn't last. But Thomas was patient, giving her space when she needed it, holding her when she'd allow it, proving with every day that he meant what he said about staying. In late June, nearly 2 months after they'd first met, Thomas took Katherine back to his hilltop at sunset. They'd fallen into the habit of visiting the spot weekly, and Katherine had come to love it as much as he did. They sat on their usual blanket, eating cold chicken and watching the sky turn colors that seemed too beautiful to be real. Thomas was quieter than usual, and Katherine sensed he had something on his mind. "What is it?" she asked finally. Thomas set down his plate and turned to face her fully. "I've been thinking about the future, about what I want and what you want and whether those things might be the same." Katherine's heart started to race. And I know we haven't known each other long. I know you're still healing, still learning to trust. But I also know that I love you, Katherine Lawrence. I love your strength and your honesty and the way you're brave even when you're terrified. I love how you stayed all night with a wounded stranger, and how you talked to your sister's grave, and how you're learning to let me in even though every instinct tells you to run. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Katherine's breath caught. "I'm not asking for an answer right now," Thomas continued. "I know you need time, but I want you to know my intentions. I want to marry you, Katherine. I want to build a life with you, here on this land we both love. I want to give you a home and a family and every reason to believe that love can be good." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small diamond. "This was my grandmother's ring. My father gave it to my mother, and she gave it to me before she left for Denver. She told me to save it for the woman who made my heart feel full." Katherine stared at the ring, emotions warring inside her. Joy and terror, hope and fear, all tangled together until she couldn't separate one from another. "I don't need an answer tonight," Thomas said again. "Take whatever time you need, but I wanted you to know where I stand. I'm all in, Katherine, completely and totally committed to you and to us." Katherine reached out with trembling fingers to touch the ring, the gold warm from Thomas's pocket. "What if I can't be a good wife? What if I'm too broken?" "You're not broken. You're healing, which is different." Thomas took her hand, holding it gently. "And I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for partnership. Someone to face the hard days with, someone to celebrate the good ones. Someone to build something real and lasting." "I want that," Katherine whispered. "I want it so much it terrifies me." "Then let's be terrified together." He closed the box and set it in her palm. "Keep this. Think about it. And when you're ready, whenever that is, give me your answer." Katherine clutched the box to her chest, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of grief this time. They were tears of overwhelm, of possibility, of feeling too much after so long feeling too little. "I love you," she said, the words feeling foreign but right. "I don't know how to do it well yet, but I love you, Thomas Dalton." His smile was brilliant, transforming his whole face. "That's all I need to hear. We'll figure out the rest together." He pulled her into his arms, and Katherine let herself be held, let herself feel safe and cherished and hopeful. The sun set in glory around them, painting the world in shades of gold and promise. That night, Katherine sat in her room at the boarding house, the ring box open on her bedside table. She studied the simple band, imagining it on her finger, imagining the life Thomas was offering, a ranch wife, a partner in building something lasting, a future that included laughter and hard work and the possibility of children, the possibility of joy. It was everything she'd stopped letting herself want, everything that seemed too dangerous to hope for. But Thomas had been patient and steady for 2 months now. He'd proven himself in ways large and small. He'd never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel like her grief and fear were burdens. And Katherine was tired of being afraid, tired of letting loss define her entire existence. She made her decision that night, but waited until Saturday to tell him. When Thomas arrived to pick her up for their regular supper, she was waiting on the porch with the ring box in her hand. His eyes went straight to it, hope and anxiety warring in his expression. Katherine stepped close to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Ask me again," she said. Thomas swallowed hard. "Katherine Lawrence, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and partner and the person I wake up next to every morning for the rest of my life?" "Yes," she said, the word coming out clear and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." The joy on his face was worth every moment of fear. Thomas let out a whoop of celebration and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed breathlessly. When he set her down, he took the ring from the box with shaking hands and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I'm going to spend every day proving this was the right choice," Thomas promised, kissing her soundly. "I'm going to hold you to that." They were married 6 weeks later in late August when the prairie grass was golden and the sky impossibly blue. The ceremony took place at the small church in Concordia, attended by Mrs. Morrison, Mrs. Fletcher, several of Thomas's ranch hands, and half the town who'd taken an interest in their courtship. Katherine wore a dress she'd made herself, ivory silk with lace at the collar and sleeves. Thomas wore his best suit and looked nervous as a colt until Katherine walked down the aisle and smiled at him. The Reverend kept the service simple and heartfelt. When it came time for the vows, Katherine's voice wavered only slightly. "I promise to try," she said, the words they'd agreed upon together. "To try to be brave, to try to trust, to try to love you the way you deserve. I promise to show up even on the hard days, to be honest even when it's difficult, to build this life with you one day at a time." Thomas's eyes were bright with emotion as he said his own vows. "I promise to be patient, to be steady, to prove every day that I'm staying. I promise to hold you when you're hurting and celebrate with you when you're joyful. I promise to love you, Katherine, in every season and through every challenge, for the rest of my life." When the Reverend pronounced them married, Thomas kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to more eyes than just Katherine's. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed twice the number of guests. Old Pete had outdone himself with the cooking, and someone had brought a fiddle, filling the evening with music. Katherine danced with her new husband as the sun set, his arms strong around her, his smile constant and warm. She danced with some of the ranch hands too, and even with William Carter, who'd recovered fully from his bullet wound and come to wish them well. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift away, Thomas led Katherine to the house. Their house now, though it still felt strange to think of it that way. He carried her over the threshold, a tradition Katherine would have scoffed at months ago but now found endearing. Inside, someone had lit lamps in the parlor and the bedroom, casting everything in a warm glow. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dalton," Thomas said, setting her down gently. "That's going to take some getting used to. We've got time." He cupped her face in his hands, his expression serious. "I know tonight is probably overwhelming. If you need to take things slow, we will. No rush, no expectations." Katherine was overwhelmed, but not in the way he thought. She was overwhelmed by gratitude, by the improbability of having found this man and this chance at happiness. She was overwhelmed by how far she'd come from the broken woman standing in a cemetery, certain she had nothing left to give. "I'm exactly where I want to be," she said, and kissed him to prove it. Their wedding night was tender and occasionally awkward, two people learning each other in new ways. But it was also sweet and intimate, full of whispered words and gentle touches. Katherine discovering that vulnerability could be beautiful when you trusted the person seeing you exposed. Afterward, lying in Thomas's arms in the darkness, Katherine felt peace settle over her like a blanket. "I was so sure I'd forgotten how to love," she murmured, "that those parts of me were dead." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "They weren't dead, just sleeping, waiting for the right person to wake them." "That's dangerously close to poetry, Cowboy. I told you I'd work on it." Katherine smiled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and dark, full of possibility. Inside, she was home. Life on the ranch was an adjustment. Katherine had to learn the rhythms of ranching life, the early mornings and constant work, the way weather and seasons dictated everything. But she found she liked it, liked the purposefulness of the days and the satisfaction of building something tangible. She helped old Pete with the cooking when he'd allow it, learned to manage the household accounts, and continued her sewing, making clothes for Thomas and the ranch hands. She rode Dancer regularly, growing confident enough to venture out onto the range with Thomas, checking fences and watching the cattle. The hard days still came. There were mornings Katherine woke with grief pressing heavy on her chest, days when the loss of Sarah and her parents felt fresh and raw. But Thomas was there, steady and patient, giving her space to feel without trying to fix it. And gradually, the good days began to outnumber the hard ones. Katherine laughed more, worried less, allowed herself to imagine a future that included children and grandchildren, and growing old with the man she loved. In late October, she realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week to be sure before telling Thomas, finding him in the barn repairing a saddle. "I think I might be pregnant," she said without preamble. Thomas dropped the leather he was holding, his face cycling through surprise, joy, and worry in rapid succession. "You think or you know?" "I'm fairly certain. I'll see the doctor tomorrow to confirm." He crossed to her in 3 long strides, pulling her into his arms. "How do you feel about it?" Katherine let herself be held, considering the question honestly. "Scared, excited, terrified something will go wrong. Happy at the thought of our child. All those at once, all those at once." Thomas pulled back enough to look at her face. "We'll get through it together, all of it, the fear and the joy and everything in between." Dr. Harris confirmed the pregnancy the next day, estimating the baby would arrive in early June. Katherine felt the fear rise sharp and immediate. Childbirth was dangerous. Women died from it regularly. What if she survived only to fail the child as she'd failed to protect Sarah? Thomas found her that evening sitting on their hilltop, staring out at the darkening valley. "Talk to me," he said quietly, settling beside her. "What if I'm a terrible mother? What if I'm too damaged to raise a child properly?" "You're going to be wonderful," Thomas said with absolute certainty. "You're strong and loving and brave. Our child will be lucky to have you. What if something goes wrong? Childbirth or illness or any of 1,000 things that can hurt a baby. Then we'll face it together." He took her hand, lacing their fingers. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen, Katherine. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise you won't face any of it alone." Katherine leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solidity. "I want this baby. I want our family. But the wanting makes me vulnerable." "It does," Thomas agreed. "But it also makes you alive. Really, truly alive, not just existing." She thought about that, about the difference between the woman she'd been in that cemetery and the woman she was now. About how love had cracked her open but also filled her up, given her reasons to hope and dream and plan. "All right," she said finally. "Let's be alive together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Katherine felt tired and occasionally nauseated in the early months, but by winter she was thriving. Her body changed. her belly growing round with their child, and Thomas treated her like she was made of spun glass. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," she protested when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. "Humor me," he said, taking the basket anyway. "Let me take care of you." Christmas came, their first as a married couple, and Thomas gave her a rocking chair he'd built himself, perfect for nursing a baby. Katherine gave him a shirt she'd sewn with careful stitches, embroidered with his initials. As winter gave way to spring, Katherine felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings inside her. She was hanging laundry when it happened, and she stood stock still, one hand pressed to her belly, tears streaming down her face. Thomas found her like that, frozen in wonder. "What's wrong?" he asked, alarmed. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right." She grabbed his hand and placed it on her belly. "Wait, just wait." A moment later, the flutter came again, stronger this time. Thomas's eyes went wide with amazement. "That's our baby," Katherine said, laughing and crying at once. "That's our child, Thomas." He pulled her close, mindful of her belly, his own eyes wet. "We made a miracle. We made a family." In early June, on a hot afternoon when the cicadas were singing in the cottonwoods, Katherine's labor began. Thomas sent one of the hands for Dr. Harris and stayed by her side, holding her hand through the contractions, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. There were moments Katherine was certain she couldn't continue, moments when the pain seemed too much to bear. But Thomas never left, never wavered, his voice steady and encouraging. "You can do this," he said over and over. "You're the strongest person I know. Our baby's almost here." At midday on June 7, 1877, Katherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The moment the doctor placed the squalling infant on her chest, Katherine felt her heart crack open in an entirely new way. "Hello, little one," she whispered, studying the tiny face, the perfect fingers and toes. "Hello, sweet boy." Thomas was crying openly, his hand gentle on the baby's downy head. "He's beautiful. He's absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel, after Thomas's father, with the middle name Lawrence to honor Katherine's family. Samuel Thomas Dalton, small and wrinkled and wonderful. The weeks after Samuel's birth were exhausting and joyful in equal measure. Katherine was sore and tired, learning to nurse, adjusting to the constant demands of a newborn. But every time she looked at her son, every time Thomas held him with such tenderness and awe, she felt grateful beyond words. Old Pete declared himself honorary grandfather and took to spoiling Samuel shamelessly. Mrs. Morrison came out from town to help for the first week, clucking over the baby and showing Katherine tricks for soothing colic. And Katherine, who'd been so certain she'd forgotten how to love, found that her heart had more room than she'd ever imagined. Room for Thomas and Samuel, room for the life they were building, room for hope and joy alongside the old grief. Samuel was 6 months old when Katherine took him to visit Sarah's grave for the first time. It was a cold December afternoon, but she bundled the baby warm and made the trip. "Sarah, this is your nephew," she said quietly, holding Samuel so he could see the grave marker. "Samuel. He's got my eyes and Thomas's stubborn chin, and he's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Samuel cooed and grabbed at a strand of her hair. "I wish you could have met him. Wish you could have met Thomas. You'd like him, I think. He's good and kind, and he makes me laugh." Katherine blinked back tears. "I'm happy, Sarah. Really, genuinely happy. I never thought I'd be able to say that after losing you, but it's true." The wind whispered through the grass, gentle and almost like an answer. "I'm going to tell Samuel about you when he's older. About how brave you were, and how much you loved stories, and how your laugh could light up a room. I won't let him forget that he had an aunt who would have adored him." Katherine placed a small bouquet of winter flowers on the grave, then headed back to where Thomas was waiting with the wagon. "Everything all right?" he asked as he helped her and Samuel up. "Everything's all right," Katherine confirmed, settling Samuel into her lap. "I was just introducing our son to his family." Thomas leaned over and kissed her temple. "Let's go home, home." Such a simple word for such a profound thing. But that's what the ranch had become for Katherine, a place where she belonged, where she was loved, where she could be fully herself without fear. The years passed in the way years do, marked by small joys and occasional challenges. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who followed Thomas around the ranch like a shadow. When he was 3, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, with red hair like Katherine's mother and a temperament as sweet as summer peaches. 2 years after Emma came another son, Jacob, who was quieter than his siblings but observant and clever. The house filled with noise and laughter, with the chaos of children and the satisfaction of watching them grow. Katherine still had hard days, times when grief or fear rose up unexpectedly. But they were rare now, and when they came, she had Thomas and the children and the life they'd built to anchor her. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Katherine back to the hilltop where he'd proposed. The children were spending the night with old Pete, who'd somehow become a doting grandfather figure despite his gruff exterior. They sat on a blanket watching the sunset, the summer evening warm and perfect. "You remember the first time I brought you here?" Thomas asked. "You brought fried chicken and told me you wanted to teach me how to love. And you told me you didn't know how." Katherine leaned against him, comfortable and content. "I was wrong about that, or maybe I did need to learn. Either way, you were a good teacher." "You did most of the work yourself," Thomas said. "I just showed up and refused to leave. Best decision you ever made, Cowboy." "Second best. First best was seeing you in that cemetery and deciding to make sure you got home safe." Katherine turned to look at him, this man who changed her entire life with his patience and persistence. "I love you, Thomas Dalton, more than I ever thought I could love anyone." "I love you too, Katherine, more every day." They watched the sun set in glory, the same sky they'd watched a decade ago, but everything different now. Everything better. "Thank you," Katherine said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For seeing something worth fighting for even when I couldn't see it myself. For proving that love doesn't always end in pain." Thomas pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Thank you for being brave enough to try, for letting me in, for building this beautiful life with me." They sat together until the stars came out, talking about the children and the ranch and their plans for the future. They talked about adding onto the house, about teaching Samuel to really ride next year, about Emma's fascination with books and Jacob's quiet way with animals. They talked about everything and nothing, the easy conversation of two people who knew each other deeply and loved each other well. When they finally headed home, the house was dark and quiet, old Pete having bedded down the children hours ago. Thomas and Katherine checked on each one, tucking blankets and pressing soft kisses to sleeping foreheads. In their own room, getting ready for bed, Katherine caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. She looked different from the woman she'd been 10 years ago. Older, yes, but also lighter. The grief lines around her eyes had softened, replaced by laugh lines. Her posture was easier, more open. She looked like a woman who'd learned to love again, who'd learned that heartbreak, while real and painful, didn't have to be the end of the story. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm thinking about how wrong I was, how I told you I was too broken for love, that I didn't know how. And now I know that love isn't something you remember or forget. It's something you choose. And I choose this every day. I choose you and our children and this life we've built." Thomas rested his chin on her shoulder, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Best choice you ever made." "Second best," Katherine corrected with a smile. "The first best was saying yes when you asked me to try." They stood together, reflected in the mirror, two people who'd found each other in the darkness and built something luminous. Behind them, the room glowed with lamplight. Beyond the windows, the prairie stretched vast and beautiful under a sky full of stars. Katherine had come to Concordia broken and alone, certain that the best parts of her life were behind her. She'd stood in a cemetery and told a kind stranger that she didn't know how to love, but Thomas had seen something in her worth fighting for. He'd been patient when she was difficult, steady when she was afraid, present when she wanted to run. He taught her one day at a time that love could be safe, that opening your heart didn't guarantee pain, that sometimes vulnerability led to joy, and Katherine had learned. Slowly, painfully sometimes, but truly. She'd learned to trust again, to hope again, to let herself be loved. She'd learned that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the past didn't mean sacrificing the future. She'd learned that she wasn't too broken for love. She was perfectly broken in all the right ways to appreciate what she'd found. The next morning, Katherine woke to the sound of children's laughter and the smell of old Pete's coffee. She dressed and went downstairs to find chaos in the kitchen. Samuel was trying to help make breakfast and making more mess than progress. Emma was singing to her doll. Jacob was watching everything with his serious eyes. And Thomas was in the middle of it all, flour in his hair and a smile on his face, looking perfectly content with the beautiful disaster of their family. He looked up when Katherine entered, and his whole face brightened. Every single time, even after 10 years, he looked at her like she was something precious, like she was exactly what he'd been waiting for. "Morning, beautiful," he said. "Morning, cowboy." Katherine poured herself coffee and joined the fray, helping Samuel flip pancakes and wiping syrup off Emma's face and cutting Jacob's food into careful bites. It was ordinary and perfect, exactly the kind of life she'd stopped believing she could have. After breakfast, the whole family went out to the barn to check on a mare about to foal. Samuel asked 1,000 questions. Emma wanted to pet every animal, and Jacob watched everything with quiet fascination. Thomas put his arm around Katherine's shoulders as they watched the children explore. "You know what I was thinking?" "What's that?" "That this is what I dreamed of back before I met you. A full life, a house full of noise and love, someone to share it all with. But I could never picture the details, couldn't see the woman's face or hear the children's voices. And now I can't imagine it any other way. Can't imagine anyone but you, anything but this." Katherine leaned into him, watching Samuel try to show Emma how to approach the horses properly while Jacob toddled after them. "Neither can I." The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge. There were hard winters and failed crops, sick children and accidents, all the normal trials of ranching life. But there were also celebrations and triumphs, moments of pure happiness that made everything else worthwhile. When Samuel was 10, Katherine taught him to sew and discovered he had a talent for it. When Emma was 8, she started reading to the ranch hands, who gathered around like she was performing Shakespeare. Jacob grew into a quiet young man with an uncanny ability to understand animals, able to gentle even the most skittish horse. And through it all, Katherine and Thomas's love deepened and matured, growing from that first fragile hope into something solid and unshakable. They had their disagreements, moments of frustration or miscommunication. But they'd learned how to fight fair and forgive quickly, how to choose each other even on the hard days. On their 20th anniversary, their children now nearly grown, Katherine and Thomas took a rare day away from the ranch. They rode out to their hilltop, the place that had become sacred to them over the years. The view hadn't changed. The river still wound through the valley, the town still sat along its banks, the prairie still stretched to the horizon, but everything else was different. 20 years, Thomas said, shaking his head in wonder. Doesn't seem possible. Best 20 years of my life, Katherine replied. Even counting the time Samuel broke his arm falling out of the barn. Or when Emma got lost in town and we thought we'd lost her. Or when Jacob came down with scarlet fever and we spent 3 days certain we were going to lose him. Even counting all of that, Katherine confirmed. Because we got through it together. Because even the worst days with you were better than the best days before you. Thomas pulled her close, and they sat watching the sunset, comfortable in the silence. They'd said everything that needed saying over the years, declared their love in 1,000 ways both large and small. You ever think about that first night? Thomas asked. When I found you in the cemetery. Sometimes, I think about how lost I was. How certain I was that I had nothing left to give, nothing left to hope for. And now, Katherine smiled, thinking about their children and their ranch and the life they'd built. Thinking about how far she'd traveled from that broken woman in the cemetery to this moment of perfect contentment. Now I know I was wrong about almost everything. I wasn't too broken. I hadn't forgotten how to love. I just needed someone patient enough to wait while I remembered. Someone steady enough to prove that not everyone leaves. I'm glad I was stubborn enough not to take no for an answer. I'm glad you saw something in me worth fighting for. Thomas turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her face the way they'd been that first night he kissed her. His hair was graying at the temples now, lines creasing his face from years of sun and work and laughter. But his eyes still held that same kindness, that same steady love. Katherine Dalton, he said seriously. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, the best choice I ever made. I'd do it all again, every moment, every challenge, just to end up right here with you. I love you, Katherine said, the words as true now as they'd ever been. More true, maybe, deepened by years of proving them in action. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone. I love you too. Always have, always will. They kissed as the sun set. Two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something lasting. Two people who'd proven that love could heal, that patience could win, that sometimes the broken pieces fit together better than they'd ever been whole. When they finally returned to the ranch, their children had prepared a surprise anniversary celebration. The house was decorated, a special supper laid out, gifts waiting on the table. You didn't have to do all this, Katherine protested, even as her heart swelled with love for these 3 remarkable humans she'd brought into the world. Of course we did, Emma said, hugging her mother tight. You two taught us what love looks like. We wanted to celebrate that. The evening was filled with laughter and stories, the children sharing their favorite memories of growing up on the ranch. Old Pete showed up with a cake he claimed the hands had made, though everyone suspected he'd baked it himself. Several of the ranch hands stopped by to offer their congratulations and well wishes. Late that night, after everyone had left and the children had gone to bed, Katherine and Thomas sat on their front porch, looking out at the land they'd worked and loved for 20 years. No regrets. Thomas asked. Not a single one, Katherine replied. You. Only that I didn't find you sooner, Katherine laughed, lacing her fingers through his. I wasn't ready for you sooner. I needed to be broken first to understand what I was risking when I let you in. Otherwise, I might not have appreciated what we have. Everything happens in its own time, I suppose. Suppose it does. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Closer by, the horses moved in their stalls. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of summer. It was peaceful. It was home. It was everything Katherine had never dared to hope for, wrapped up in this man and this place and this life they'd built together. She thought about the woman she'd been, standing in that cemetery and telling Thomas she didn't know how to love. She thought about all the moments between then and now, all the small choices that had led to this perfect evening. And she was grateful. Grateful for Thomas's stubbornness, grateful for her own courage, grateful for every single day that had brought them here. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible, for loving me when I was unlovable, for teaching me that my heart wasn't as broken as I thought. Your heart was never broken, Katherine, just wounded, and wounds heal given time and care. You gave me both. You gave them back 100-fold." They sat together until the stars wheeled overhead, talking and dreaming and planning for the years still to come. They talked about grandchildren someday, about passing the ranch to Samuel when they were ready, about growing old together on this land they loved. They talked about everything and nothing, the comfortable conversation of two people who'd spent 20 years learning each other's hearts. And when they finally went inside to bed, climbing the stairs hand in hand, Katherine felt complete. Not because Thomas had fixed her or saved her, but because he'd stood beside her while she learned to save herself. That was what love looked like. She understood now. Not grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but steady presence and patient faith. It was choosing each other every day in the big moments and the small ones. It was building something together, brick by brick, day by day, until you looked up and realized you'd created something beautiful. Katherine had come to Kansas broken and alone, certain that love was behind her. She'd told a cowboy she didn't know how to love, and he'd said, "Let me teach you." And he had. Through patience and persistence, through showing up and staying, through proving that not all love ended in pain, Thomas had taught her that her heart was bigger than she knew. He taught her that broken didn't mean beyond repair, that grief and joy could coexist, that opening yourself to love again was the bravest thing you could do, and Katherine had learned. She'd learned to trust, to hope, to dream. She'd learned to build a family and a home. She'd learned that she wasn't too damaged for love, that all those parts of herself she thought were dead had just been waiting for someone gentle enough to wake them. She'd learned how to love. And in learning, she'd found everything she'd stopped believing existed. As she drifted off to sleep that night, safe in Thomas's arms, Katherine thought about that woman in the cemetery one last time. She wished she could go back and tell her that everything would be all right, that the pain wouldn't last forever, that hope was waiting just around the corner in the form of a cowboy with kind eyes and a patient heart. But maybe that woman had to walk through the darkness to appreciate the light. Maybe Katherine had to believe she was broken to understand how strong she really was. Either way, she'd made it. She'd survived the loss and grief, learned to love again, and built a life more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. And every day, for the rest of her life, she would be grateful for the cowboy who'd seen her standing in a cemetery and decided she was worth fighting for. The cowboy who'd offered his heart to a broken woman and waited patiently while she learned to accept it. The cowboy who'd become her husband, her partner, her home. Thomas Dalton, who taught her that love was always worth the risk,